Welcome to this explainer. Politics can often feel like just pure, unadulterated chaos, right? But underneath all that noise, there are actually strict structural rules at play. Today, we're going to impartially break down the systemic frameworks presented in Chapter 3 of the highly influential book, How Democracies Die. We're looking at this not as some partisan debate, but strictly as an anatomy lesson on how complex systems function and, honestly, more importantly, how they fail. So let's jump right in by asking a foundational question. When you picture a democracy actually falling apart, what pops into your head? Probably a sudden, dramatic coup, right? Tanks rolling down the street, a general taking over the television broadcasts. I mean, that's how it usually happens in the movies. But the source material challenges that cinematic idea completely. We are so conditioned to look for explosions, but systemic collapse is actually much, much quieter. It's less about a sudden external attack and a lot more about internal structural fatigue. The text reveals a hidden structural rule that completely flips how we should look at political stability. Democracies do not fall just because norms disappear or because a single rogue actor breaks the rules. They actually fall when the system's elites stop enforcing those norms. Picture a massive structural pillar. It isn't being violently knocked over from the outside, it's quietly cracking from the inside. Systems weaken primarily from internal failures in enforcement. It's the literal absence of a penalty that actually brings the whole structure down. To understand exactly how this happens, here is our roadmap. First, we'll cover the democratic immune system, then the anatomy of abdication, the psychology of surrender, feedback loops of decay, universal patterns, and finally, defending the system. We're going to objectively dissect this step by step. All right, part 1, the democratic immune system and how parties act as system stabilizers. The authors use a really fascinating biological metaphor here that we need to unpack. According to the analysis, political parties aren't just there to win elections. They actually act as the primary white blood cells of a democracy. This is called the institutional immunity model. Just like your body's immune system actively fights off an infection, a political party's job is to actively fight off insurgent, rule-breaking behavior from within its own ranks. In practice, this means party leaders doing things like withholding campaign funding, denying key committee assignments, or just publicly denouncing extremists within their own tent. When these internal enforcement mechanisms are actively suppressing bad behavior, the system survives. The rules are held intact by the very people operating within them. Moving into part 2, anatomy of abdication, focusing on withdrawing enforcement. Because we have to ask, what happens when those gatekeepers just stop functioning? What happens when the white blood cells just stop fighting? The authors use the Republican Party as their primary model to demonstrate what they term the Great Republican Abdication. Now, viewing this neutrally, let's look at the core mechanics of their definition. It is a deliberate, or even passive, withdrawal of enforcement by political elites who previously acted as system stabilizers. Notice that word passive. It's not necessarily an active endorsement of rule-breaking. Passivity is a choice here. It's a really dangerous vacuum created by withdrawing internal punishment. It's essentially stepping aside, putting your hands in your pockets, and letting the infection spread simply because fighting it is deemed too costly. And this brilliantly illustrates the massive mismatch in incentives that makes this vacuum so deadly. On one side, you have the party elites. They prioritize short-term electoral victories, they're terrified of losing their voter base to more extreme candidates, and so they rationalize non-enforcement as just a strategic necessity. It's kind of like a bouncer at a club who stops checking IDs because the line is getting too long. It offers short-term relief, but it is an absolute long-term disaster. Then, on the other side, you have the insurgents. They actively gain power by exploiting this weakened internal discipline. And once they realize they aren't going to be punished, they rapidly escalate their norm-breaking behavior. Which brings us to part 3, the psychology of surrender, or the mindset of collapse. We really need to look at the psychological underlayer to figure out why elites would step aside and act like that bouncer. Because, this is never an overnight surrender, it is an incremental cascade. Step 1 is simply the fear of base loss. Elites calculate that they fear losing their deeply passionate voters way more than they fear some abstract institutional damage. Step 2 is gradual moral desensitization. Repeated exposure to norm violations naturally reduces emotional resistance over time. Literally, what was shocking on Monday becomes the new normal by Friday, which leads right into Step 3, the rationalization cascade. This is where the psychological comfort sets in. Every single failure to enforce the rules is justified as being absolutely necessary to prevent the other political party from winning, which is framed as a supposedly much worse outcome. And that brings us to this absolutely crucial point, captured perfectly in the text. Institutions often collapse not through conviction, but through incremental rationalization of unacceptable behavior. Think about that. Systemic collapse is rarely some intentional, malicious plot by the establishment. It's just a slow drift. It's, 1,000 tiny compromises, each one logically justified in the moment by intelligent people, that eventually hollow out the entire institution from the inside out.
Okay, part 4, feedback loops of decay and the architecture of destabilization. Because once that psychology takes hold, the system architecture itself starts working against stability.
We see this play out clearly in 2 specific vicious cycles. This first one is the abdication loop. It starts with that fear of electoral loss we were just talking about. That fear leads directly to reduced norm enforcement. Because the rules aren't being enforced, norm breakers are empowered. And here's the truly ironic tragedy of this whole mechanism. By letting the norm breakers thrive, the party elites actually become more dependent on those very insurgent factions to win future elections. Which, of course, loops right back around to making them even more terrified to enforce the rules the next time. They literally build their own trap. And without punishment, the system also enters the second cycle, the escalation loop. An initial norm violation happens. There's a lack of internal punishment. This leads to rapid normalization. Because that behavior is now considered normal, the insurgents have to commit even more extreme violations just to stand out. And because those aren't punished, the cycle just accelerates. Rapid normalization, more extreme violations, systemic destabilization. It creates a competitive race to the bottom in institutional restraint, spinning faster and faster until the guardrails simply snap. Let's zoom out for part 5, universal patterns and cross-domain transfers. Because to really look at this neutrally and objectively, we have to realize this isn't just a political phenomenon. The laws of systemic decay are totally universal. Just think about the 2008 financial crash. In trading, if you weaken your risk controls for a quick short-term profit, the systemic blow-up risk is absolutely going to catch up to you. In chess, leaving small tactical threats unanswered leads to a total positional collapse later in the game. In cybersecurity, ignoring minor intrusion signals inevitably leads to a full system compromise over time. And in the military, failing to discipline internal units destroys command coherence. It's the exact same architecture everywhere. When enforcement shifts from principle-based logic to advantage-based logic, systems collapse. Finally, part 6, defending the system. Let's look at some critiques of this model and the counter-strategies needed to actually save a failing system. To keep things balanced and rigorous, let's play devil's advocate for a second. The author's model definitely has some blind spots. First, it assumes a clear moral consensus exists on what a democratic norm actually is, which, let's be honest, isn't always true in a highly polarized society. It also potentially underestimates genuine ideological transformations within parties, writing them off merely as opportunistic abdication when, well, voters might actually just be changing their minds. It simplifies incredibly complex voter dynamics, and perhaps most importantly, it overattributes agency to party elites. It doesn't fully account for how massive systemic polarization pressures practically force elites into these defensive postures. Institutional decay is often co-produced by voters, media, and elites all working together in this huge, complex web. But even keeping those critiques in mind, the core structural takeaway gives us a pretty urgent battle plan for survival. To prevent a system from collapsing, these counter-strategies have to be deployed cohesively. Institutions must actively enforce internal rules despite short-term electoral or financial risks. They absolutely must maintain clear, unmoving boundaries for acceptable behavior. They have to resist becoming dependent on norm-breaking factions just for a few quick wins. And ultimately, they must be willing to preserve their institutional identity over short-term popularity. Basically, you have to be willing to lose a battle to save the system. It really is a fascinating look at the mechanics of institutional health. So I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought regarding literally any system you inhabit, whether it's your workplace, an organization you volunteer for, or the government itself. If breaking the rules consistently yields an advantage without any internal penalties, do the rules actually still exist? Remember, systems do not fail when rules disappear. They fail when breaking them stops being punished. Once the enforcement vanishes, the guardrails are already gone. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep questioning the systems around you.